Ritual plays an important role in many cultures. In ancient Japan, an elite group of warriors used ritual, skill, and bravery to control society: the samurai.
What jobs today require great skill and bravery?
Blue-collar workers are brave because they, it takes a lot to do the same thing day after day.
Being a scientist takes a lot of skill because, especially if you want to find cures for diseases.
I think doctors are very brave because their responsibility is the well-being and health of people's lives.
I think people who work in skyscraper construction are very skilled because it's an unorthodox job. You have to be very organized, you have to have a lot of balance.
The leaders of our country are very brave because it takes their job to keep our country safe.
I think the people in the military are really brave.
Medical researchers.
Rudy Giuliani is definitely like a hero.
I think teachers are brave because they are responsible for our future.
In Japan, from the 13th to 16th centuries, power lay in the hands of the shogun, or supreme military commanders, who lived in clans spread out across the Japanese countryside. These rival clans battled for control of land. It was a time of political disorder, but despite this, a new Japanese ingenuity emerged that was uniquely tied to ritual. Each shogun maintained his own army of samurai warriors, knights who battled to expand their leader's domain. But the samurai were not just warriors. They were also skilled craftsmen who mastered both the art and science of battle. What are the secrets to samurai science? The secrets of their swords, castles, armor, and martial arts. Samurai swordsmiths perfected a technology that few have ever matched. Their swords slice swiftly and precisely. The samurai treated their blades with reverence and ritual. Some swords, they believed, had personalities of their own. Sadatoshi Gasan's family first began forging swords in the 13th century.
It's scary how much of the swordsmith's personality appears as the sword is created. Not only do you have to polish your craft, but also your personality, because it too will appear in the sword.
An evil sword maker would create an evil blade, so swordsmiths could only be men of the highest morals. These craftsmen faced an ancient challenge. A sword must be hard enough to hold a sharp edge, but soft and flexible enough to absorb blows without breaking. Japanese sword makers were among the first to solve this problem, creating a blade that was both sharp and resilient. And they did it more than 800 years ago. Their secret lay in their extraordinary ability to combine steels of different hardnesses. The hardness of a sword's steel depends on the amount of its carbon content. A sword maker, through experience, can tell when the steel is hard enough. Then he folds the steel. Each fold doubles the number of layers. More than a dozen folds create paper-thin layers in the metal. This hard steel will become the keen cutting edge. Next, he fashions a softer, lower carbon steel. Now he joins the two together. The softer metal becomes the flexible core. He wraps the hard steel around it. The outer layer can hold a razor-sharp edge. This is the method that made Japanese swords superior to all others. Hammering gradually draws the metals out into a single long blade. But he's not finished yet. Now the swordsmith takes the most difficult and magical step of all. He hardens the metal, fusing the steels together. He must raise the temperature of the entire blade to over 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, which he calculates by judging its hue in the darkened forge.
The very last moment takes the most concentration. Is it going to be a good sword or a bad sword? Everything will be determined at this point.
Now he will plunge the blade into cool water. If he miscalculates and the blade is not the right temperature, it will warp as soon as it hits the water. He will lose weeks or months of work. As the two steels cool, they contract at different rates, giving the sword its characteristic curved shape. It's a success. The sword made the samurai feared and famous. A samurai sword weighed less than 3 pounds, about the same as a European blade. But its cutting edge was harder and sharper. The samurai were feared not only for the sharpness of their blades, but also for their ability to use them. Here at Karshima Grand Shrine, one of Japan's oldest religious sites, samurai have studied martial arts since the 1200s. Carl Friday, a historian of Japanese martial arts, studies the ancient sword fighting technique called Karshima Shindu.
European swordsmanship, particularly into the early modern era, tended to focus more and more on straight thrusting type attacks done with relatively light, straight weapons. Japanese swordsmanship focuses mostly on big slashing motions. We're slicing at the opponent.
Students use traditional wood swords for practice. The Karshima school teaches students to keep the blade moving at all times.
Sword moves in circles all the time, right? So that there's no break in momentum. If you're moving up and down in straight motions, you have to stop the sword and then start it again and then stop it again between each move, and that takes extra time and energy.
Samurai perfected their technique so that fights usually ended in just a few moves. The slightest misstep was fatal. They learned to move in and out of striking range, to read eye and body language. But the real secret of the Karshima school was learning to make the first move. If you act first, you can anticipate your opponent's response. And at the moment he thinks he's won, turn the tables. It was the samurai's tactical brilliance that made him so deadly. Like a chess player, he always thought several moves ahead. A samurai learned hundreds of combinations of moves and trained relentlessly until his lessons became second nature and his mind, body, and sword moved as one. The ritual of practice increased the power of the warrior. In battle, the samurai wore armor of ingenious design. While Europeans made armor from metal only, the samurai took a different approach. They designed a composite material made of leather, iron, bamboo, and silk. Although it was no lighter than chainmail, it was more flexible. So flexible that samurai wore it in sword fights and in unarmed combat. Masami Ozawa at the Tokyo National Museum has mastered the secrets of making samurai armor.
Japanese armor is made for ease of movement, so it fits loosely on the body.
A suit like this one made for a high-ranking warrior was expensive. It took over a year to make. And in today's currency, it would cost tens of thousands of dollars. These small plates made of tough rawhide are the armor's building blocks. The samurai's armor maker cuts holes for stitching and painstakingly smooths each plate. He lacquers each piece. Then he stitches them together using flexible lacing made from monkey skin. Each plate overlaps the next to create a flexible panel.
First, you make the panels. Then once they're lacquered, you sew them into the suit.
These overlapping shields helped cushion a sword's blow. The flexible panels bent with the blade's impact, dissipating the sword's energy.
Japanese armor is typically very elaborate. It's not just for protection. It's made to stand out, to show your strength and power to your enemies and friends.
A samurai earned land and titles for his distinction in battle. His ornate armor ensured that his status would be noticed. But 300 years after the samurai rose to power, the nature of their battles changed. In the mid-1500s, a samurai warlord bought a new weapon from Portuguese traders. He turned it over to his master swordsmiths. And within 50 years, the Japanese were making more guns than any country in Europe. This was the most violent period of samurai warfare. Rival warlords fought each other with armies of up to 60,000 warriors, including thousands of gunners. The gun forced the samurai to build hundreds of large, strong castles. And none shows the brilliance of the samurai's master builders as clearly as Himeji Castle, built by one of Japan's most powerful warlords. Tens of thousands of laborers toiled for more than a decade to complete it. At its center rises a huge tower. From here, the warlord would oversee his troops during an attack. This 90-foot wood structure owes its longevity to two huge beams that run all the way from the basement to the 6th floor. They are so sturdy that in an earthquake they anchor the floors, preventing them from slipping horizontally. Architectural historian William Coldrake has studied the samurai carpenter's craft.
Well, a carpenter would have up to 150 different sorts of tools, and he'd never show them to anyone else. They were his secret, cherished possessions. The tools themselves preserved the traditions that he'd inherited from his father and his grandfather, and they handed those techniques on from one generation to the next as closely guarded secrets.
The carpenter's chisels and cutting tools were made with the same metalworking technology sword makers employed. The samurai's carpenters used no nails to hold their structures together. Instead, they devised intricate interlocking joints that kept even massive beams in place. Their tools included more than 40 planes with different shapes and sizes, and dozens of saws, chisels, and hammers. Their ritual was to spend up to a third of each day sharpening their tools. This maintained the sharp edges needed to cut softer woods. And it was also a kind of meditation that helped the carpenters rid extraneous thoughts.
Carpentry was more than just a manual trade. It was a religion. It's like the one-stroke swordsman. In the same way as the samurai would pull his sword to kill an enemy, the carpenter who used his plain blade had to be able to get it right in one go.
Carpenters did use nails to fasten floorboards and roof tiles. And in Nijo Castle in Kyoto, they used them in a creative design to protect the warlord. These are the Nightingale floors. An assassin trying to slip through the hallways could not tread silently. The carpenter's secret lay in the method used to fasten the floorboards. Each board was connected to the joist beneath it with a metal bracket and nails. With each step, the boards rose and fell slightly, rubbing the nails and brackets together and creating the sound of a nightingale. Himeji was protected by other defenses typical of Japanese castles, but they are more elaborate here than anywhere else. At its heart stood a fortified tower, the defender's last citadel. Around it was a series of walls and gatehouses designed to confuse and trap invaders. This is just the inner fortress. Beyond it lay residences for more than 3,000 samurai, enclosed by 2 additional moats and outer walls. Craftsmen erected the outer walls with a brilliant system of masonry. Workers fit enormous irregularly shaped rocks together like a jigsaw puzzle without using any mortar. On top of the stones, carpenters constructed shorter wood walls covered with white plaster to resist bullets and flaming arrows. Samurai could peer out from them and fire through their portholes. attackers could enter only by storming a gatehouse.
The entrance to the castle was protected by an elaborate series of gatehouses of varied and ingenious design. And in this case, you had to actually go up the hill that you see here, turn at right angles, and you would then come under sustained fire from the samurai who were in the turrets above the gatehouse, in the walls beside it, and on each side as well.
Warriors who broke through the inner compound's first gate would have found themselves facing yet another gate, and then another. And attackers who found their way through would be sitting ducks.
This is where it became even harder for the attacker. While still climbing up these steps, they had to go around this wall 180 degrees, up the path, and then find that they were confronted with yet another gatehouse.
Attackers who made it this far would believe they were close, but they'd be wrong. They'd have to enter at least 8 more gates, following a winding path 3 times longer than the straight distance to the tower. Troops who finally reached the central tower would still have to storm a building as heavily fortified as it was beautiful.
The Great Keep was 150 feet high. It had a timber structure weighing over 5,000 tons, and it was one of the most impressive and largest buildings constructed before the 20th century in Japan.
This building served as the final fortress and command center. Defenders had clear shots from its barred windows and could hurl stones at attackers who tried to scale its walls. Inside, the samurai kept enough food and arms to withstand a long siege. And the warlord would command the battle from the very top floor. Wide windows gave him a clear view of the battle below. And if the castle were about to fall, here the warlord would commit seppuku, a ritual suicide that ended his life with honor. Although many Japanese castles were destroyed in battle, the formidable Himeji was never once attacked. Perhaps because no one who saw it could imagine it was possible to take. In the late 1600s, the age of samurai warfare finally came to an end. With the help of the gun, one warlord, Tokugawa Ieyasu, defeated all his rivals. Japan was finally unified and at peace. The samurai would fight no more wars. But the samurai philosophies live on. The samurai believed that striving for perfection could lead to something higher. Today's practitioners of Japanese traditional arts strive for the same perfection and enlightenment. The shogun set up a rigid social system in which everyone's role was defined. What was the purpose of these roles and rituals? These tightly controlled roles helped maintain the Japanese status quo. To this day, Japanese traditional values exist in the modern world. Did you know? The Chinese language is completely different from Japanese. That's because China didn't have contact with Japan until AD 500. At that time, missionaries introduced Buddhism to Japan. With religion came knowledge of Chinese writing and culture. Those cultural ties between China and Japan still exist today.